Sarah Broom. Sarah, you want to say anything?
I'm Sarah Broom. I made the Yellow House, and I'm so happy to be here with you, of all people.
It's talking to people who you actually love is sometimes like hard, I think, in public. But in this time right now, I'm just want to say thank you for allowing me to have this conversation with you. Selfishly, it's keeping me whole. And I also want to say to everybody listening, if you have a question for Sarah, please put it in the chat. We're going to talk for about 20 minutes or so, and we want to make sure you get the questions that you have to ask Sarah in Sarah's ear. So I just want to start, though, with where we left off. And for people who don't know,
Yeah.
Sarah and I had a conversation in Jackson, Mississippi a few months ago after the event. We tried to dip out of the dinner real fast. We weren't able to dip. And then I took you back to the place where you were staying. And then we sat there and we talked in the car for it felt like hours. And one of the last things we talked about were rooms, like rooms in literature, rooms in our life. And you pushed me and you provoked me and you actually changed my writing trajectory by talking about the absence of rooms in the stuff that I've written that you read. And I just want to talk about rooms in general, but I want to talk specifically about the rooms in the Yellow House. Like, which rooms today, where we are today in 2020, right now, do you feel most attached to? And which rooms are you still sort of afraid to enter, re-enter?
Oh. I think a lot still all the time about the rooms in that house. I was just thinking the other day about, because it was a long, narrow house. And so if you wanted to get away from somebody, you kind of needed to each post up on complete separate ends of the house. There were no hiding places. But the den, which was like the room in the back where the giant TV sat on the floor, where,
Mm.
you know, it was a strange room because there was a wall of windows and then there was another wall that was sort of incomplete. The sheetrock hadn't been finished, but it was
Mm.
this room where there had been a history of parties. And my dad, one of the things my dad did in his lifetime was build this room. And so it was the room where we watched the horror movies. It was the room where, I was a blind child, I couldn't see a lot. And so I would have to sit really close to the TV, like, so my horror was so sort of up close. And I dream about that room sometimes because I think in some ways it gives me a little bit of a clue
Mm.
about what I'm trying to reach for when I think
Mhm.
about home. It's that comfort, that ease, that
Mhm.
feeling that you can just kind of sink in. And it's imperfect. It's imperfect, right? There's sheetrock missing. But we're not worried about that, right? Because there's so much happening in the room itself.
And can you talk a bit about just in terms of literary philosophy? Because you broke me open that night, fam. Like about the importance of not just the bodies, the voices, the secrets, but can you talk to me about the importance of the physicality of rooms in your work, but also rooms in which you live? Like there's a mystery and an unveiling in talking to you about rooms and also in your work. And I just want to get a little bit even deeper if we can.
It's interesting because in the book I have this as an epigraph. The French philosopher Gaston Bachelard has this quotation where he says, "The things we have forgotten are housed, and by
Mm.
remembering houses and rooms, we learn to abide within ourselves."
Mhm.
But the whole great part of that quote for me was that I felt like my grandmother and mother knew that and were saying that
Mhm.
long before I had ever read Gaston Bachelard say it,
Mm. Yeah.
and here's why. Because I think that there's something, so we all know the story of Black people and houses and the absolute injustices baked into the system. We know what it cost to own something. We know the difficulty of holding on to it. We know all of those things. But there's also an interiority about it. There's a way in which I wanted to think about, but what was inside of the house? We know all the stuff that was happening outside the door, but what was going on inside? What was the act of creation that my mother was engaged in? What was the thing bigger than even a room that she was trying to create?
Right.
And how do we think about objects and rooms and history and traces, and that the fact that it says something about the ways in which we are not dislocated people, that we somehow exist in a space, in a spot. And I mean, that is ultimately what we're all trying to do, right? When we're writing, is go for that kind of interior zone that is decorated in all sorts of ways.
Yes.
Pretty and sometimes really, really ugly. And so I think that's what you and I were talking about, right? Having to do with, in each of our work and in your work, where do people go and sit? What's the thing of their own creation?
Yeah. And what you did, and what you did for me personally was, and I don't know if you remember me saying this or not, but you forced me to confront my sometimes resistance to describe the rooms in my memory where most of the trauma happened. Do you know what I mean?
Yeah.
And it's like I can describe the bodies, I can hear sounds, smells, but like when you push me in that car, lovingly, to think about the actual shape of the room, the kind of carpet, what was on the wall, it made me understand a lot about my own work, but it also made me understand how you could pull off something like the Yellow House. And I want to talk about something that I just think a lot of people don't talk about when we talk about the Yellow House. To complete that book, as I've said over and over again, you've got to have journalistic chops, you've got to have fictive chops, you've got to have poetic chops, but you got these other chops that most of us don't have. Like, you actually had to make a map, right? Like, map making had to be something you had to like actually embrace. Can we talk about that a little bit?
It's interesting because the map making part is so fraught for me even still, but it was so interesting because the moment I understood, when I started just going in the research, I have this file folder this thick that's just maps that have been made. And I'm looking at so many maps and just like, where the hell are we? Literally, where are we? We are not on the map, right? And I know that in my own consciousness, and this is the trick of not believing, right? When someone wants you to not believe your eyes, because I know that we exist and I know that these interesting people exist who lived on the short end of a long street with me. But for some reason, the decision was made not to map us, right? What is that saying about the composer of the map, about who's allowed to make a map, about the utter irrelevance of maps, about the power of maps, right? And so it was so interesting because not only was I working in this attempt to say, okay, what are the sort of the holes, the grottos? How do I write into those absences? How do I say, here we go, we exist? But beyond that, because that feels like a really kind of elementary enterprise and not exactly what I was going for, but to say, how do I make something that has so much layering, so much nuance, so much granular detail, that it exceeds what most maps do, that it sort of provides us a level of mapping that is maybe new, or gives us a different way to think about geography and space,
Yes. And, in my first book, I tried to write about these Black children who were written off the face of the earth, like literally written off the face of the earth. So they had to try to, bring themselves back as characters. But I'm interested in the way the Yellow House wrestles, obliterates, and I think reconfigures the notion of respectability. And I think respectability has now become a bad word that we don't even really want to wrestle with. But near the end of your book, you write this, and I want to get your thoughts on it. You write, "We had inherited from our mother the tendency, the need even, to make things belong to us presentable. But even Carl could not put the house back together again." Now, presentable is not necessarily respectable, but I'm interested in how you tease out the differences between presentable, respectable, against the backdrop of a Black family literally written off of the map. Like, how do we wrestle with that?
I think, I don't know, this is so interesting a question, and I love it so much because, I like that it's connected to the idea that my brother is ultimately helpless in this scenario, right? He can't actually fix the big thing that needs to be fixed, but the small thing he has on some level is this sort of ability to make something presentable. And I have been very interested in this because my sense now, even just thinking of my grandmother and my aunt who died and all of this sort of matriarchal lineage of people, is that in the absence, in the kind of flailing that often was happening within, I think, there had to be a way to compose the self. And it wasn't about composing it so that it's like, my pet peeve as a writer, right, is when people say, "Wow, you must have really cried when you were writing this book." And I'm like, I cried over the structure of the sentence. I cried, right? No, this is about composition. This is composed. This is made. And I dare say that, many of our grandmothers and mothers are doing no less composition, right? And I think this is what Alice Walker is trying to say when she writes In Search of Our Mother's Gardens, that if we were to sort of interrogate and shake the ground a little bit, we would find that actually in our immediate past are women, people who were trying with everything they had to create in order not to go mad. And so I think for my mother, there is a kind of I know for a fact, and I feel this deeply, that my mother might have been a poet had she not been saddled with 1,000 children and sort of the circumstances of her life. And I think time was a kind of dangerous belief that we gained in a kind of form of American presentation. Because as we see now, we are all about, the performance, and the intrigue, and sometimes we are, I think, doing that to our own detriment. And I think in some ways, right? Because in my story in particular, we came to feel that the house is falling down literally was our own falling down. We came, we became a little bit confused about that. And I wonder how much of that is, I wonder what you think about this, but it has something to do with shame. It has something to do with the ways in which shame allows you to feel bad about something which ultimately might not even be your fault, but really comes to stand in for you. But all of that to say, I think that it's complicated, but I think it had more to do with the interior self as a means of kind of composing and pulling the pieces together and saying, I still have something, right? Some means and form of expression.
I mean, your book is layered with people who I think do really complicated things with shame. And again, I think the conventional wisdom that we've been taught recently, sort of, is that shame is something we need to push back. Absolutely, right? But and not but, and I wonder about those people harm people, ashamed to put their children out there in the world without help. So I think your book complicates this notion of shame as it complicates these notions of respectability. But I just want to know if that was intentional. And I hate to be that person who's like, did you try to do that? But like, were you intentionally like wrestling with shame? The flip side of shame, when you went through all those generations of people that we see in the Yellow House.
Yeah, I mean, what I understood was some kind of, I think what was lacking in the stories that I saw, there was no just basic story that existed even, but I thought that the stories of the city in particular were underdeveloped stories for the most part, that they didn't have the kind of nuance that made the world that I was growing up in. And so, like, for instance, you know, one could tell a childhood story that's about, oh, you know, I had this friend next door and we lived in a long, narrow house, you know, blah, 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 you know, but like, if we add an element to that house, the windows, okay, what did you see when you were growing up in the long, narrow house? What was your view from the windows? And so your view is, you know, trailer parks at first, and then after is a dump truck shop going up where the trailer parks used to be. And that communicates something to you about the landscape, right? But we can take that even further and say, okay, so that's about zoning. Okay, so that means that the City Planning Commission in 1955 decided that this business could go up across the street from houses. They made that choice, right? Or did they?
Right.
And so if you just keep going, if you just keep stacking just the facts and reality of life, it gives you, I think, a much more complicated story that doesn't necessarily have a happy ending or has any ending that wraps up. But is maybe directly connected to the times we're living in now.
And you know, since when you came to Jackson and you left, we talked about, you know, going back to New Orleans and going back to New Orleans East particularly. Can you talk about what you feel and what you've thought since you've written this book and gone back home?
Well, you know, it's so interesting because the street where I grew up is a place I have for most of my life avoided after the house was gone because it just felt really painful to show up there.
Right.
One of the last times I was there was a new kid on the street. You know, there's just one or two houses left. And this adorable child, I think I was there for the New York Times photo shoot. So this is like pre-COVID. So I'm coming back and I'm just like out there doing my photo shoot face, you know?
Yes.
And this kid runs up to me. I've never seen this kid in my life. It turns out her mother has recently died. And my growing up neighbor, who is one of the last people living on the street, comes out of the house, you know, photographer disappears. We're like hugging and it's this moment. And I just couldn't get that child out of my mind. You know, I think of her even now, this special moment. And so that land, that spot really testifies to the fact that we are all tethered in some way, right, to spots. And sometimes it doesn't make logical sense. I mean, I think the Native Americans have been teaching us this for generations, right? And I think it still remains a special spot for me, and it's a really hard place, even now, to think about because it has grown over, and there's no way to tell unless you know all that was there, you know?
Yeah. And this is is a selfish question. And I think I know the answer to it. But, you know, The Yellow House, for y'all who don't understand or don't know, is a book that you all need to get. You all need to read it 2 or 3 or 4 times, especially now. I think you need to read it to get lost in the layers, but I think you also needed to read it to get lost in the absolute genius it took to write it. But I'm interested in, like, when you set out to write this book, at what point were you like, I did that shit. I did that. Like, when were you just like, I did that? I'm for real asking you.
As my partner Dee Reese will attest, who's I think here, that is a very hard thing for me to say about something I do. Absolutely, I'm working on that. I need to be able to say, I did that. I did that. When I won the National Book Award, when I was sitting in the room, and they showed, before I won. So my mom is to my right, and they're showing this video, and Toni Morrison is in the video, and she's saying something about, the bigness of winning a National Book Award. And in that moment, I was like, holy, I mean, it occurred to me that I was in, suddenly I could see clear as day the distance between me and my mom in that yellow house in that Jefferson Davis Elementary and me in that room. And I was like, oh, shit, I have traveled. And I think in that moment, it wasn't so much about like, did you make the perfect book? Because I can look at that book and think of things I would want to do differently. That'll show up in the next book. I'll do something. I've learned something, and now I can pull that off in the next book, right? But I don't have to judge it like that anymore. I've come to realize I could just say, I made whatever it is that exists now. You know what I mean? And I think so. Yeah.
Let me ask you something else. Also, I want to say, what's up, D? What's up, Jamie Hatley? What's up, fam out there listening? Can we talk about? We started to talk about this before we went on. Can you talk about? I mean, because the book is, I think, about this question. But can we locate it in the moment? Like, can you talk about the importance of textured, multifaceted Black love now in this pandemic, and the similarities and differences you might feel the way it is explored in The Yellow House?
Oh my God. Well, this is, I'm just sitting around and kind of watching. I'm sitting back and just going like, looking and watching, because now so much is being created and made, and these narratives are being formed, right? And that's a tricky time to be thinking about history, actually. But one of the things that I know for sure is that, one of the things I care so much about is trying to build out a world where people are not the sum total of their disaster. And that world is deeply interior. That world is not only spiritual, but that world is psychological, and there are so many moving elements to it, and people get to surprise you and say things you don't imagine. And that's kind of, I think, for this particular moment, how I think about Black joy and resistance even, right? It's like living in the language and the particularity. And, my brother Carl, called and told me that he had been going around wearing a face mask on the front and the back, for for people who came approaching from the front and people who approaching from the back. And I was like, I know it can't be. And then my brother took a picture of him, my other brother. And he was indeed wearing but just like the particularity of that, right? The small detail of that. And I just think that there is no way for me to tell a story about some of the most complicated people I know who had, I think for so many people in this particular moment, this is the first time that they're having to engage with something which is beyond them, outside their door, a war we're waging, while also dealing with the self. And frankly, that's been our history since the beginning of time, right? We were fighting for the literal right to go to school, right? And be taught while, we were having personal things happen and people were fighting cancer and doing all sorts of things, right? So I think this moment is so complicated in that way. But there's something about the essence that really matters to me.
Yeah, rereading the book, and this, probably for like the sixth time now, I thought about risk a bit more. And last week my grandmother had her 91st birthday, and I drove all the way to Forest, Mississippi. My auntie came from Vegas. My mama came from Massachusetts. All these, folks came from Mobile, knowing full well we should not be traveling right now, right? But we didn't grow up in a yellow house, right? We grew up in a pink shotgun house up on cinder blocks. And I was that person who kept saying, y'all, we got to do this over Zoom. We got to do this over Zoom. And my family, for complicated reasons, like I'm the only boy, I've always been, and they treat me like a man, and they usually listen to what I say. But they weren't even, they was like, okay, Key, I hear you. We coming to see mama. We risking it all in mass to come see our mama in that place that she raised us.
Yes.
So I'm thinking again in the yellow house about the consistent paradox of risk, and how, we often talk about the risk without talking about the national negligence that makes the risk necessary. And I just want to know if you can love without risk might not really even be love.
Ooh. One of the things that I try to forget is just how painful it was to make this book. Just remembering and trying to make sense of things, and the absolute risk of exposure, this feeling of exposure, this feeling that there are things I'm not supposed to know, and certainly I'm not supposed to be telling.
Yes.
But then I kept thinking about the circumstances of my birth. The fact that the first house I ever knew was on a street that was cut off from the rest of itself. That I somehow grew up on the short end of a long street where we had to cross an actual highway to get to the rest of our lives, to get to school, to get to the bank, to get to the post office, to get anywhere. We had to essentially risk our lives and put ourselves in danger. And then that made me think so much about, how we were cut off from the city and the bodies of water we were surrounded by, and all the ways in which we had been risking over and over again, right?
Yes.
Trying to make a world. And I think in certain ways, that risk, right? I think perhaps I don't even know how not to risk.
Right.
That's a foreign concept to me. But how do you risk? I guess what I want to ask you is, how do we risk with care? How do we risk knowing that there are people who won't be delicate with the thing we work really hard to do, right? Yeah. I think it's useful not to think about those people when you're in the act of risking.
Right. Which becomes hard when the editors, the agents, the publishers are people so far removed spiritually, geographically, racially from the yellow house.
Right. And frankly, it shouldn't be an issue. And this is going to get me onto one of the things I really can't stand. Because, when I pick up, Javier Marias or Marquez or W.G. Zabald or
Mhm.
Dostoevsky, who I love, or Nicole
Mhm.
Krauss or David Grossman, who's writing from Israel, or Orhan Pamuk in Turkey,
Mhm.
I don't understand anything about the context of their lives. That's why I'm reading. I'm learning. I'm figuring it
Yes.
out. That is the gift of the work. And so
Yes.
I want to somehow be in respected in the same way, which is to say, I've made a series of choices. Take my word for it.
Right.
These are choices I've
Yes.
made as a person
Yes.
trying to be a writer here, right? This is not, and I think sometimes the perception or the idea when it comes to us is that, oh, did you mean this? Yes, I
Right.
did. And so
Right.
how can an editor read with the same care that they read, someone from, you know, uh, any place else that they don't fully understand?
Yes.
Why the double standard?
Right. Right. Fam, I adore your book. I
Thank
love you
you.
deeply. Let's get some of these questions though. I want people to make sure they get what they came here for. Um,
I see my cousins here. Hi, Ash. What's up, girl? I love you. I miss you.
can you see that question? It says, "Hi Sarah, you wrote about the history of New Orleans in the book. What kind of research did you do?"
So, actually, so a lot of different kinds. So, archival research, so like library, microfiche, old file folders and dusty drawers from City Hall, and driving. My dad was born in a town actually called Raceland, Louisiana. So driving to Raceland and going to cemeteries and going to Catholic churches, which have actually incredible records of everything. I also did interviews with my family. I did kind of like oral histories. I did more journalistic type interviews and just read a million books. Yeah. So, um, you know, research from all places, and then just my own memory and my eyes, and trusting my eyes, and then fact checking my memory.
All right. All
Yeah.
right. It says, "Hi Sarah, who are some authors who inspired you early on, and what are some of your favorite books?"
Oh, I have too many favorite books to name, and that changes weekly, my favorite. But early on, oh my God. Well, like, Baldwin, of course. And okay, let me just talk about the people I love: Baldwin and Gail Jones. If
Ooh,
you
we
haven't
don't
read
talk about Bill Jones
her,
enough.
listen, we need to talk more. Look, let's have a Gail Jones book club, okay? Because I feel like we need to talk more about Gail Jones. And also just throwing in that Gail Jones, we know about Gail Jones because of Toni Morrison's generosity, because she essentially found her as an editor and made sure she was published. But yeah, I have, a firmament of writers who I return to over and over again, and that changes, and I like to reread. So, and I read really slow. So, it's always changing, but honestly, I just love books. And what I know now, having written one, is that any book is hard to write. Any book. I don't care how badly you think it's done, it was hard to write. And so I have like a newfound respect, and I just try to read and, be part of what the writer's trying to do as much as I can.
All right. What we got next? This book feels like it blurs the lines of memoir in so many powerful and beautiful ways. Can you share about your vision and process? What can you share about your vision and process, maybe?
Yeah. So, it's interesting. I wonder what you think about this idea of memoir. Because I think that was the first thing that came at me, was like, oh, this isn't quite a memoir. And I think maybe that has more to do with how we define memoir
Yeah.
in certain ways. Like, what is memoir actually supposed to look like? Because if it is in fact a way of creating a persona and an I, which tries to make sense of experience, there are actually so many ways to do that. But I think I just want to say about my vision and process that the big overriding thing for me, and the thing that I believe as a human in the world, is that context is everything. And the way we complicate narratives and get to an underbelly of a story is to build context so that people aren't outside of their element. So in other words, the absence of context feels like displacement to me.
Mm-hmm.
So if I build in the context, I know that in this particular story, and I don't know that this will change for anything I ever write, but in this particular story, there is no way I'm going to show up on page 1 and start telling my story, because it just is wrong in terms of how this book is moving in the timeline. So I was trying to just be really faithful to my belief in context, my belief that, that things are passed on to us, that we don't just appear, that, what we know about the science that says intergenerational trauma can pass through people you never even met.
Yes.
So I think in terms of for this book, I was just trying to build out this 100-year story that had a lot of elements that made it enjoyable to live in, and that also in the process of that allowed me to resurrect a house I really, really loved.
And let me just also say, we need to read Corregidora by Gail Jones and The Yellow House by Sarah Broom back to back all summer, fam. That's what we need to do. All y'all looking at this shit reading, I'm telling you, read Corregidora, read The Yellow House, read them again, and then let's all reconvene and talk about how different we were after reading both multiple times than when we began. Those books actually talk to each other in ways I hadn't thought about until this second. But let's get some more questions up here. Do you feel you wrote the book? Or did the house write the book? And you were the vehicle. Do you feel the house had to tell its story?
Okay, Chuck, I so appreciate this question, but I'm going to tell you straight up, I definitely wrote this book. I have the scars. I have the scars to show for it, Chuck.
Right.
The house, I wish the house would have wrote this book, actually.
Yeah. Right. I love that question. I love the answer even more than
great. It's a great question. It's a great question.
What else can we get? What else can we get up in here?
Anybody else Ron Kavanaugh's in the audience. Mosaic.
Oh, Ron, what up, Ron? All right. Kids today often laugh at the old folks who talk about their spiritual language and speaking in tongues. Does your spiritual language still linger with you? If not, why do you think that gift abandoned you as your intellect?
Where's the rest of the question? Because this is a good one.
That's a great question. Is there an end? Is there an end to that question?
Alice Faye asks a brilliant question.
If
your
not,
spiritual
why do you
language
think
still linger with you? I mean, I don't know. I haven't tried to speak in tongues anytime recently. But I think of myself as a really spiritual person. And because I believe so deeply in traces, that places have traces and we as people are full of traces, I don't think the gift abandoned me. I think that intellect and spirituality can evolve concomitantly, with each other and at the same time.
Yes. That's a great answer right there. And Alice Faye, who apparently is from Memphis.
Jamie
says,
Hadley in the house.
yes. All right, what else we got up in here, y'all? I think we got about 5 to 10 more minutes. Let's get as many more incredible questions as we can. Sarah, I love The Yellow House and Angela Flournoy's book, The Turner House. Like, yes. Angela, I am from Detroit. Unfortunately, my childhood home doesn't exist anymore. And I'm wondering, how do you return home when home no longer exists? I think that's what that last word is.
Right. Well, I love Angela Flournoy, and am just waiting with bated breath for whatever she ever writes. And I love Detroit, actually. It's one of the places I really wanted to go to before all of this happened, and just like talk about the book and meet people. I think that, this is a question, Davida, that a lot of people have it when home doesn't exist anymore. Yesterday, I was reading about the monsoon and all the people in India who were fleeing, right? And just trying to like find dry land. And it just is such a human condition, really. And I've been thinking a lot about what home means for me. And I think that home is sometimes the thing between two people. I think home can be a feeling, a sensual thing, a memory, something you do with your body, or a smell, or I want to be pushing myself on this matter of what home is. And maybe that's the thing I'll be exploring, in all of my work to come. So thanks, Davida. That was a great question. I also want to shout out my cousin, Pamela Broom, who is an agriculture woman in New Orleans and farmer, and one of the more brilliant people I know on earth. And it's so nice to see you, cuz.
I love when the cousins show up. I love that. Oh, okay. Does the absence of overt religion play a role? Ron Kavanaugh is not playing. Does the absence of overt religion play a role?
Okay. Maybe you should answer that one, Kies. Ron, that's a talk we need to have over bourbon, Ron. I don't know if that's if we could go there on the 2 minutes we have left on the Barnes and Noble interview. Does the absence of overt religion play a role?
Well, let me ask you this question, Sarah. What do you think absence of overt religion means to you?
I guess absence of overt religion means like church going, to my mind. What were you thinking?
I mean, that's what I thought. I thought this was more about like the concretized, like, going to church, hearing a sermon, going home. And
he's saying it's so important in the Black narrative.
Yeah. I mean, you want me to jump in there? What you want me to do?
Yeah.
I mean, you know what I'll say? I'll say something that I've never said. When I moved back to Mississippi, I never thought that I would move back to the place in Mississippi I moved to, right? The place that offered me the job. And it's a neo-Confederate place in town. And I've never needed the practice of Black church going as much in my life until I moved here. And I've never been more afraid of what will happen if I practice going to church than I am now. So I've developed a practice where I listen to spirits more, I channel spirits more, I write about spirits more. But part of me thinks I really need to take my ass into a loving, rigorous Black church that loves all parts of me, all parts of my family and friends. And I'm skeptical of that church existing. But that's on me.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting because having been, sort of born Catholic, and then a strange version of Catholicism, and then we were Baptist, and then we were non-denominational, and then me being like really into church, there is something very linked. It's a formation of the self, and I think there is a kind of ritual that I am part of always, whether or not I'm going to church. There is a way, for instance, that Sundays for me are a very particular kind of day. The pace of them, the mood of them. It's like there is this sort of quiet of them. The day, it's a different day from any other day. And I think that has to do with this sort of ritual that I was involved in for so long. Um, but I want to go to church, but I feel the way you do, which is, how do you find a place that, because I'm most comfortable going to mass, but then when I think about the Catholic Church, I'm not at all comfortable going to mass.
All right, maybe can we get one more question? What kind of advice do you give your fans, some of which are aspiring writers? And can I ask this question? Do you think of people as fans?
No.
Me
That's
either.
still something I think that's some of which are aspiring writers. Well, I think that you have to write and show up and stay in the chair when it gets really, really hard. And that feels like a little bit of a cop out of an answer, because I'm really thinking a lot about the writers whose names I don't know, who are actually writing, but who are not getting published. And I just want to say that I recognize that there's a difference between the two. That you can be writing every single day, and people say no when you submit your draft, or you don't have an agent, or all of those things. So I'm saying, even still, I think the job is to show up and to stay and to keep writing. What do you think, Casey? Is that crazy, or do you have something to add? Or
No, I think you got to show up, and I think you have to talk about your successes as well as your failures with specificity to people who love you. And I think some of us who struggled so long to get on struggled partially because we could not talk about those failures, especially, and we couldn't talk about those successes. And Sarah and I had a conversation earlier today that I was scared to have with anybody, and it wasn't about failure. But I was just like, I need to talk to somebody about this, and that's going to relieve me, but also it could maybe relieve her. So communicate like the specificity of the failure. You know what I'm saying? The grit and grind of the failure and the grit and grind of the success. And I think that you'll be a healthier writer. I don't know if that means you'll be a more quote unquote successful writer, but I think it's ultimately about it anyway.
Yeah, that's good. See, I knew you had a lot to say.
Yo, thank you so much for joining this event. Please, 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 if you haven't, you need to go pick up The Yellow House by Sarah Broom. The paperback just came out. You need to go get the paperback. The hardback, I think, is still out there in the world. And I'm telling you, you need to pair that with Corregidor. That's my homework.
I love that.
For the summer. And thank you, Barnes and Noble. And I always thought it was Barnes and Nobles with the S. So thank y'all for making this possible. And I adore you. I thank you so much for your work, and I thank you for loving us so fiercely, Sarah.
Thank you, Casey. I love you and your work. Thank you. And thanks to the audience of all these great people, Southern and Northern.